Let's dig a little deeper now with CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid. She joins us from Washington. So, Paula, the government has until 6 p.m. Eastern today to submit additional legal briefs to the appeals court justifying the president's executive order. What case do you expect them to make? Do you expect them to even make that deadline?
Yes, they will make that deadline. Of course, they're heavily invested in this case, Vlad, and I think you're going to see them make the same arguments that they've been making. First and foremost, they're going to argue that this is within the president's power, that what he did through this executive order had to do with national security and immigration, both of which they argue are the purview of the executive and not the courts. Now, they will also argue that this does not discriminate by religion, just on country of origin. And that's very important because how this is being attacked is that it is biased against religion and therefore unconstitutional, one of many ways this executive order has been attacked. And they will also argue that all of the countries were issued sponsors of terrorism by prior administrations. This has been sort of how they have defended this executive order, and I don't expect them to make any new or novel arguments this afternoon.
And Paula, for our viewers, so that they can understand, what is the federal judge in Washington state saying about the ban?
Well, the federal judge in Washington, when he was asked whether or not he should essentially just press the pause button on this, he said yes. He said he had some concerns about whether or not this will ultimately be upheld on the merits. The questions before the judge right now isn't whether or not this law is constitutional. It's whether it should be continued to be enforced while the courts decide whether or not it's constitutional. And in arguments on Friday, the judge heard both sides, and he said, look, I have some concerns about whether or not this law was narrowly drafted enough to convince me that this was about national security. He pointed to the fact that the government didn't make carve-outs for people with green cards or people who got their visas because they helped the U.S. military. And that, he said, raised some concerns for him as to whether or not ultimately this law will be found constitutional, and therefore he put in a temporary restraining order. Think of it as sort of hitting the pause button, and that's why the travel ban is not being enforced today.
And Paula, that judge, James L. Robert, in his opinion, he wrote that fundamental to the court's work was what he called a, quote, vigilant recognition that it is but one of three equal branches of our federal government. So I'm guessing, and I'm not a lawyer, but that's implying that that the judge recognizes that there will be challenges to this because that's how our system of government has been set up.
Yes, and some people have taken issue to whether or not there are three co-equal branches, but traditionally that is how it works. And previous presidents have certainly had their executive actions and executive orders challenged in the courts. Some of them have prevailed and some of them have not. But of course, this judge was under no illusion that this would be a controversial and wide-ranging decision.
All right, let's talk about these tech companies who have gotten involved here. What role do they play in this?
It's very important for them to make their case and to support the Attorney General of Washington because there were some questions about whether or not a state could come forward and file a lawsuit like this. Usually, in order to file a lawsuit, you have to prove that you have personally been injured. And the state of Washington and the other states, they're arguing that they were injured because of their economies and their residents, the impact that it had on those two entities. And it was really important, especially in the preliminary findings, that they had the support of some tech companies. Now they have dozens and dozens of tech companies also coming to their defense. But it helps bolster their standing and the fact that they are injured and how they are injured by this law.
So, Paula, heading to the Supreme Court, your opinion?
Most likely. Again, we're not even arguing the merits of this law yet. We're just arguing about whether or not it should continue to be enforced, the executive order, while the courts discuss the merits of this argument. So I think once we get an answer, and it will likely be a very quick answer tonight or tomorrow on whether or not this restraining order will stay in place, once they start arguing about the merits, whichever side loses will appeal to the highest level. And I have no doubt that this will likely reach the Supreme Court. Whether or not they choose to take it up remains to be seen.
All right, Paula Reid in Washington for us. Thanks, Paula.